Hey, blue overalls. Yeah, you with the mop bucket. Get in here. James Marcum's voice cut through Iron Peak boxing gym like a whip crack, bouncing off concrete walls thick with the smell of leather and old sweat. He stood centering, gloves already laced, muscles coiled beneath black athletic shorts, grinning the kind of grin that expected obedience. Let's give everyone a little demonstration. I bet the closest you've ever been to a real punch is mopping up someone else's blood. William Henkel stopped mid-stroke, the mop handle stilled in his grip. He looked up slowly, 38 years old, blue overalls faded at the knees, a gray t-shirt damp with the work of a man who'd learned to become invisible. Most nights he came after the fighters left. When the gym belonged only to him, the hum of fluorescent lights, and ghosts he tried not to name. But tonight, Marcum's entourage had stayed late. Tonight, the rising star wanted an audience. I'm just finishing up, William said quietly. His voice carried no edge. He bent back toward the floor, scrubbing at a scuff mark that didn't need scrubbing. Don't want to interrupt your training. Marcum threw his head back and laughed. Loud, theatrical, designed to carry. You hear that? He doesn't want to interrupt. Marcum slapped the top rope. Nah, I think the janitor's just scared to step on the canvas. Might mess up his nice clean floor. A few gym members laughed. Others shifted their weight, eyes darting between the ring and the man with the mop. No one spoke. But what James Marcum didn't know, what no one inside Iron Peak had ever suspected, was that the man gripping that mop handle had spent the last 15 years trying to bury someone he used to be. 15 years since he walked away from the sport after a single sparring session ended a life. A secret buried so deep that even his daughter, Emma, had only ever heard the word boxer without knowing what it cost or what it took. Come on now, Marcum called, swaggering toward the ropes. That same smirk he used to rattle opponents before the first bell. Just a quick demo. Show my guys what happens when someone with zero training tries to survive against a real professional. He popped his gloves together. Let them see the gap between a fighter, he gestured to himself, and a man who cleans up after us. The mop handle felt heavier than it should have. William's knuckles whitened around the wood grain as Marcum's laughter faded into the background, swallowed by a silence that existed only inside his skull. The gym dissolved, the ropes, the crowd, the fluorescent buzz overhead, all of it bleeding away like watercolors in rain. And then he was 23 again. The old Kronk gym. Summer of 2009. Cinderblock walls painted that famous yellow, peeling at the corners where generations of fighters had leaned during rest rounds, dreaming of titles they'd never touch. The air tasted like iron and ambition. 3 industrial fans pushed heat from one corner to another without cooling anything. William remembered the way his hands felt back then. Not weapons, instruments. His trainer, Earl Bishop, used to say that William didn't punch opponents. He solved them, like equations, like puzzles made of bone and bad intentions. The Detroit Ghost, the newspapers called him. 23 years old and already 32-0. 32 professional fights. 32 knockouts. Not a single opponent had survived past the 6th round. Most didn't make it past the 3rd. But the nickname wasn't about power. It was about what you couldn't see. William moved like smoke in the ring, slipping punches before they launched, reading shoulders and hips and the microtremors in a man's jaw that telegraphed everything 2 seconds before his brain caught up. Opponents swore he wasn't there, that they were swinging at memory, at afterimage, at the space where a man used to be. Promoters called him the future of American boxing. ESPN ran a feature. HBO came knocking. The title shot was scheduled for October, and everyone from Detroit to Vegas knew that William Henkel was about to become the youngest welterweight champion in 15 years. Everyone knew. Everyone except Death, who kept his own schedule. the memory sharpened now, edges cutting as William stood frozen in Iron Peak, 15 years and 1,000 miles away from the man he used to be. Danny Fletcher. Danny, who'd grown up 3 houses down on Livernois Avenue. Danny, who'd learned to box in the same crumbling recreation center, who'd sparred with William since they were 14 years old, who'd laughed when William got his first knockdown and cried when William got his first contract. Danny, who wasn't quite good enough to go pro, but who loved the sport too much to leave it. Danny, who became William's primary sparring partner because he was the only one willing to absorb punishment day after day, week after week, helping William sharpen the blade that would cut through the welterweight division. Danny, who showed up on August 14, 2009, complaining about a headache he'd had for 3 days. "It's nothing," Danny had said, wrapping his hands with tape that had seen better decades. "Probably just the heat. Let's work." They should have stopped. William knew it now. He'd known it then, somewhere in the basement of his intuition. Danny's timing was off that night. His guard kept slipping. His eyes weren't tracking right. But the title fight was 8 weeks away, and Earl was pushing hard, and Danny kept saying he was fine, kept saying let's work, Willie, let's work. The combination came natural as breathing. Jab, jab, slip outside, right hook to the body, left hook upstairs. William had thrown that sequence 10,000 times. But Danny didn't slip. Danny didn't cover. Danny just stood there. The left hook landed clean, temple shot, textbook perfect, the kind of punch that made highlight reels and ended arguments about who was the best in the division. And Danny went down. Not the way fighters go down. Not the slow-motion buckle, the survival instincts grabbing for ropes, the controlled collapse of a man who knows he's been beaten but isn't broken. Danny dropped like someone had cut his strings, like gravity had been waiting for permission, like everything that made him Danny had already left before his body hit the canvas. William remembered screaming for Earl. Remembered the way Danny's eyes stayed open but looked at nothing. Remembered the paramedics working for 47 minutes while William sat in the corner, still wearing his gloves, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to understand how the thing he loved most had just taken the person he loved most. Undiagnosed brain aneurysm. That's what the doctors said. A ticking bomb that had lived inside Danny's skull for years, maybe decades. The headaches were warnings no one heard. The punch didn't kill him, not technically. The aneurysm would have ruptured eventually from a car accident, from a fall, from nothing at all. But try telling that to the man who threw the punch. William never fought again. He canceled the title shot. Walked away from the contracts, the fame, the money that would have set him up for life. Earl begged him to reconsider. Promoters threatened lawsuits. His own mother asked him if he'd lost his mind. But every time William closed his eyes, he saw Danny's face. Open eyes. Empty gaze. The sound of a body hitting canvas without bracing for impact. He packed 2 bags, took his infant daughter, and disappeared from boxing entirely. The Detroit Ghost became exactly what his name promised. Something that used to exist, barely remembered, already fading into myth. For 15 years, William had lived in that erasure, content to be no one, safe in his invisibility, until today, until James Marcum's voice yanked him back to the surface, until the sound of gloves on leather reminded him that some ghosts never rest. The alarm clock screamed at 4:47 a.m. William's hand found the off button before the second beep. Muscle memory from years of protecting Emma's sleep. He lay still for 3 breaths, a habit from training days he'd never fully shaken, then swung his legs off the mattress and planted his feet on cold hardwood. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms in a building that hadn't been renovated since Reagan was president. Radiators that clanked like angry ghosts. A kitchen window that faced a brick wall. Rent was $700 a month. paid in cash every first Tuesday because the landlord didn't ask questions and William didn't offer answers. He moved through the dark without turning on lights. Another old habit. His body still remembered how to navigate space without announcing itself, how to exist in the margins of a room. The Detroit ghost, they used to call him. Now he was just a man who didn't want to wake his daughter before the sun came up. Coffee first. 1 scoop, not 2. He'd cut back when money got tight 3 years ago and never returned to the old measurement. The machine gurgled and spat while William stood at the counter, rolling his shoulders, feeling the familiar ache in joints that had absorbed 10,000 punches and thrown twice as many. His body still worked. That was the cruel joke. 15 years of mopping floors and hauling trash bags, and his frame remained combat-ready. The muscles remembered their purpose even when his mind begged them to forget. Some mornings he caught himself shadowboxing while waiting for the coffee to finish. Just his reflection in the dark window, hands moving through combinations he'd sworn he'd never throw again. He always stopped himself. Always. By 5:30, he was dressed in the blue overalls that had become his uniform, his armor, his invisibility cloak. The name patch said, Will, not William. Never the full name that might trigger a Google search by some curious coworker with too much time on their hands. Emma's door was cracked open. He paused there every morning, watching her sleep in the gray pre-dawn light. 13 years old now. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, almost black, with lashes that seemed too long to be practical. Her mother had left when Emma was 2, chasing something William couldn't provide. Excitement, relevance, a life that didn't feel like hiding. He couldn't blame her. Not really. Living with a ghost was exhausting. Emma stirred, and William pulled back from the doorway. On the kitchen counter, he left what he left every morning. A $20 bill for lunch and emergencies, a handwritten note with a bad joke he'd found online, and a reminder about the permission slip for her choir trip that needed signing. The choir trip. Friday night. He'd already requested the evening off. Unpaid, because Iron Peak didn't offer benefits to janitorial staff, and because William had learned years ago that some things mattered more than a paycheck. He'd never missed one of her events. Not a single concert, recital, parent-teacher conference, or awkward middle school play. When Emma played Third Tree from the Left in her 5th grade production of The Enchanted Forest, William sat in the front row and applauded like she'd just headlined Madison Square Garden. This was his life now. This was the life he'd chosen. The first shift started at 6 a.m., a warehouse on the east side that packaged auto parts for shipping. William swept floors, emptied bins, cleaned bathrooms that grown men somehow managed to destroy with astonishing creativity. For hours of invisible labor among workers who never learned his name. By 10:30, he was on the crosstown bus, eating a sandwich he'd packed the night before, watching Detroit scroll past windows smeared with handprints and condensation. Iron Peak Boxing Gym started at 11. 8 hours of mopping canvas, wiping down equipment, scrubbing the kind of human residue that accumulated wherever people pushed their bodies past comfort. The fighters ignored him. The trainers nodded occasionally. The owner, a former middleweight named Eddie Tompkins who'd never made it past regional circuits, signed Williams' paychecks and asked no questions about his past. If you're following this story, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this invisible man. William could have worked anywhere. Factories were always hiring. Office buildings needed night crews. But he chose the gym deliberately, the way a recovering addict might choose to live next door to their dealer. He needed to be near it. Needed to smell the leather and chalk and sweat. Needed to hear the rhythm of speed bags and the grunt of men discovering their limits. It was penance. It was addiction. It was both. Some nights, after the last fighter left and the lights dimmed to their security setting, William would stand at the edge of the ring and place his palm flat against the canvas. Still warm from the bodies that had worked there. Still holding the memory of violence and ambition and dreams. He never climbed through the ropes. Never let himself cross that boundary. The ring was a church he'd been excommunicated from, and he accepted his exile with the grim discipline of a man who believed he deserved it. By 8 p.m. he was home. Emma had usually finished homework by then, and they'd sit together on the second-hand couch watching cooking competition shows, her favorite, while William asked about her day and pretended he wasn't counting the hours until he could do it all again. Ordinary. Invisible. Safe. 15 years of this. 15 years of choosing the mop over the gloves, the shadows over the spotlight, the quiet erosion of days over the explosive brilliance he'd once commanded. William Henkel had built a life from the rubble of his destruction, and he'd convinced himself it was enough. It started with the bucket. William had been mopping near the heavy bags when his foot caught the edge of the yellow plastic rim. The bucket tipped, not dramatically, just enough to send a small wave of gray water across 3 feet of concrete floor. A minor inconvenience. 30 seconds with a rag and no one would have noticed. But James Marcum noticed. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Marcum's voice boomed across the gym like a ringside announcer calling a knockout. He stepped away from the speed bag where he'd been working, arms spread wide, face split with theatrical amusement. Somebody get a camera. The janitor just made a mess while cleaning up messes. That's like, what do you call that? Irony? A few heads turned. Marcum had an audience now, maybe a dozen people scattered across the gym floor. Fighters wrapping hands. Trainers checking clipboards. A couple of women on the treadmills who slowed their pace to watch. William said nothing. He retrieved the rag from his cart and knelt to soak up the spill, keeping his eyes on the floor, keeping his breathing steady, keeping the ghost locked inside its cage. Nah. Don't ignore me, blue overalls. Marcum sauntered closer, his footwork casual but deliberate, the walk of a man who understood spatial dominance, who knew how to shrink a room around his target. I'm talking to you. This is me being friendly. You know who I am, right? William wrung the rag into the bucket. You're Mr. Marcum, the fighter. The fighter. Marcum laughed and looked around, making sure everyone caught the joke. You hear that? I'm the fighter. Like there's only one. I mean, he's not wrong, but still. He turned back to William, leaning against a weight rack with studied nonchalance. What's your name, mop guy? Will. Will. Just Will? Like the verb. Marcum snapped his fingers. I got it. We'll clean. We'll scrub. We'll definitely never amount to anything. He mugged for the crowd, and scattered laughter rippled through the gym. The sound of it, that laughter, landed somewhere in William's chest like a jab he hadn't seen coming. Not because it hurt his pride. Pride was a luxury he'd surrendered years ago. It hurt because he remembered being on the other side of moments like this. Remembered the way locker rooms could turn cruel, the way young fighters got hazed, the way power always found a way to flow downhill toward whoever stood lowest. Danny used to stand up in those moments. Danny, who wasn't the most talented fighter but who had a backbone made of something harder than bone. Danny, who once threw a full water bottle at a veteran middleweight for mocking a 16-year-old amateur stutter. William just knelt there, wringing the rag, becoming smaller. Here's what I don't understand, Marcum continued, warming to his performance. He pushed off the weight rack and began circling William slowly. Not threatening, not yet, just establishing territory. You work in a boxing gym, right? You're surrounded by athletes. Real athletes. People who dedicate their entire lives to being the best at something. And you what? You watch us train while you empty the garbage. He paused, timing the beat like a comedian. Doesn't that make you sad, Will? Honestly, Doesn't it feel pathetic to be this close to greatness every single day while knowing you'll never, not ever, not once, experience what it feels like to actually be somebody? More laughter. Louder this time. Someone near the treadmills actually clapped. William's hands stopped moving. The rag hung limp in his grip, dripping gray water onto concrete he'd already cleaned twice today. Inside his chest, something stirred. Something with teeth. Something with memory. Something that remembered exactly what it felt like to be somebody. 32-0. All knockouts. The youngest welterweight contender in 15 years. The Detroit Ghost. He forced the thoughts down. Swallowed them like bile. I'm just here to work, William said quietly. Don't mean to be in your way. In my way. Marcum threw his hands up. Brother, you couldn't be in my way if you tried. That's the whole point. You exist in a completely different universe than me. I'm about to fight for a title on national television. You're about to fight a stubborn stain in the men's room. We're not even the same species. Marcum squatted down suddenly, bringing his face level with William's. Close enough that William could smell his cologne. His sweat, the protein shake still fresh on his breath. Close enough that William could see the pores on his nose and the absolute certainty in his eyes. You want to know the difference between us, Will? It's not talent. It's not training. It's that I wake up every morning knowing I matter. And you wake up every morning knowing you don't. He patted William's shoulder, twice patronizing, the way you'd pat a dog who just learned to sit. But hey, somebody's got to clean the toilets, right? Marcum stood, stretched his arms overhead, and walked back toward the speed bag like the conversation had already been forgotten. Like William had already been forgotten. The gym returned to its rhythms. Speed bags rattled. Jump ropes whispered against concrete. Trainers barked corrections at fighters who weren't moving fast enough. William finished cleaning the spill. He stood slowly, feeling the ache in his knees that came from years of kneeling on hard floors. He pushed his cart toward the utility closet, invisible again, erased again, reduced again to the man who cleaned up after greatness. But his hands were shaking. And somewhere deep beneath 15 years of silence, the ghost was beginning to remember how to walk. Cal Torres was 19 years old and still believed the world would be fair if he worked hard enough. William had noticed him weeks ago. Impossible not to, really. The kid arrived at Iron Peak every afternoon at exactly 3:15, 15 minutes after the local community college let out. He carried a gym bag held together with duct tape and optimism, wore shorts that had been washed so many times the black had faded to gray, and wrapped his hands with tape he clearly reused between sessions because the edges were frayed and the adhesive had long since given up. But the kid could move. William had seen enough fighters in his lifetime to recognize the difference between someone who trained and someone who was born for the ring. Cal had something, a fluidity in his hips, a natural understanding of distance, an instinct for angles that couldn't be taught. Raw, unpolished, desperate for guidance, but undeniably there. The kind of potential that made scouts lean forward and promoters reach for their checkbooks. The kind of potential William himself had carried into Kronk Gym 20 years ago, when Earl Bishop took one look at his footwork and said, "Son, I'm either going to make you a champion or watch you become one without me." Today, Cal was working the heavy bag in the corner farthest from the ring, the corner where the lighting was worst and the equipment was oldest. The unspoken hierarchy of gym real estate. Prime spots near mirrors and trainers went to paying clients, sponsored fighters, people who mattered. Kids like Kyle got the corners. William was emptying trash cans nearby when Marcum finished his speed bag work and began prowling the floor. That was the only word for it, prowling. The way a bored predator moved through territory it had already conquered, looking for something to stimulate its appetite. Marcum's eyes found Kyle. Well, well, well. Marcum's voice carried that same theatrical resonance. the projection of a man who'd learned that being heard was a form of power. What do we have here? Baby's first boxing lesson. Kyle stopped mid-combination. His hands dropped slightly. A mistake, a tell, the kind of defensive collapse that experienced fighters learn to hide. Just getting some work in, Mr. Marcum. Mr. Marcum. The professional fighter clutched his chest in mock flattery. So polite. So respectful. You hear that? Everybody? At least someone in this gym has manners. He circled closer to Kyle, studying him the way a chef might study an ingredient he wasn't sure belonged in the dish. How old are you, kid? 19. 19. And how long you been training? Kyle's chin lifted slightly. Pride, fragile and easily shattered. 3 years. Since I was 16. 3 years. Marcum nodded slowly, lips pursed in exaggerated consideration. 3 whole years. And tell me something, 19-year-old, 3 years of training. What's your record? The silence that followed told William everything. I'm still amateur. I've only had 4 fights. 4 fights. And, Kyle swallowed. 2 wins. 2 losses. Marcum's laughter was immediate and merciless. Not the performative chuckle he'd used on William. This was sharper, crueler, designed to cut rather than entertain. 2 and 2. You're 19 years old with 3 years of training and a .500 record, and you're in here every day like you're preparing for a title shot. He shook his head, still laughing. Kid, I was 12-0 by the time I was your age. All knockouts. You know what a .500 record means in this sport? It means quit now before you embarrass yourself further. William's hands tightened around the trash bag he was holding. The plastic crinkled under his grip. I'm still learning, Kyle said. His voice was smaller now, the pride draining out of it like blood from a wound. My coach says I have potential, I just need. Your coach is lying to you. Marcum stepped closer, invading Kyle's space, looming over him with the physical authority of a man who'd made a career out of intimidation. That's what coaches do when they want to keep collecting your gym fees. They tell you what you want to hear. You have potential. You're almost there. 1 more year and everything clicks. He leaned in, voice dropping to something almost intimate. But we both know the truth, don't we? Some people are born to be fighters. And some people are born to be what fighters step over on their way to greatness. Kyle's eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet, but close. The kind of wet that came from swallowing shame too quickly, from forcing tears back down through sheer willpower. William knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror 100 times during his early years, when older fighters told him he was too small, too quiet, too soft to survive in a sport that ate softness for breakfast. He'd seen it on Danny's face, too. Danny, who never made it past regional circuits. Danny, who lost more than he won but kept showing up anyway because boxing was the only language he knew how to speak. Danny, who absorbed Williams' punches day after day, year after year, helping build a champion while knowing he'd never become one himself. Danny, who loved the sport so much he died inside its embrace. Tell you what, Marcum continued, backing away from Kyle with a showman's flourish. I'm going to do you a favor, kid. Free lesson. Right now. Step in the ring with me for 2 minutes. Just light sparring, nothing serious, and I'll show you exactly where you stand. Consider it a reality check. Save you years of wasted time chasing something you'll never catch. Kyle's face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalog. Fear, hope, confusion. The desperate hunger of someone being offered attention by a person they'd been taught to admire. I don't have sparring gear with me today. We'll find you some. Eddie keeps extras in the back. Marcum was already moving toward the ring, already assuming compliance. Come on. 2 minutes. What's the worst that could happen? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one had called yet. William set down the trash bag. His feet stayed rooted to the concrete, but something inside him was already moving, already crossing distances he'd sworn he'd never cross again. Kyle looked toward the corner where William stood. Their eyes met for half a second. The kid's expression held a question he probably couldn't articulate. Asterisk, is this okay? Should I do this? Is anyone going to help me? Asterisk. William looked away. Kyle walked toward the ring, and the ghost inside William's chest began to claw at the walls of its cage, demanding to be released. The sparring gear Eddie kept in the back was old, cracked, and too big for Kyle's frame. William watched from behind his mop cart as the kid climbed through the ropes, headgear shifting on his skull, gloves that swallowed his hands up to the wrists. Kyle looked like a child wearing his father's clothes, like a boy playing dress-up in a man's nightmare. Marcum hadn't bothered with headgear, hadn't bothered with much of anything except the gloves he'd already been wearing. He bounced on his toes in the center of the ring, shadowboxing the air, throwing combinations at nothing while the gym gathered to watch. Word traveled fast when blood was in the water. Fighters abandoned their stations. Trainers drifted closer. Even the women on the treadmills stopped entirely, clustering near the ropes with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to an accident they couldn't prevent. 2 minutes on the clock, Marcum announced to no one in particular. Somebody time this. I want the kid to know exactly how long 2 minutes can feel when you're in over your head. A trainer near the ring pulled out his phone. The casual cruelty of the gesture, reducing Kyle's humiliation to a timed spectacle, sent something cold slithering down William's spine. Kyle raised his gloves. His stance was textbook, probably drilled into him by whatever budget coach worked with amateur fighters at Iron Peak. Left foot forward, chin tucked, hands high. Technically correct. Spiritually terrified. Whenever you're ready, champ, Marcum said, grinning. The first 30 seconds were a clinic in psychological destruction. Marcum didn't hit Kyle, not really. He touched him, flicking jabs that landed just hard enough to snap the kid's head back without causing damage. Body shots that thudded against ribs like a teacher rapping knuckles with a ruler. Each contact accompanied by commentary, by instruction delivered in the tone of a man explaining simple concepts to a slow child. See that? You dropped your right hand. Dead in a real fight. Dead, dead, dead. Kyle tried to counter. Marcum slipped the punch without moving his feet. Ooh, nice try. That was almost a punch. Very close to being threatening. More laughter from the crowd. More phones appearing, recording the massacre for social media posterity. William's grip on the mop handle had turned his knuckles white. He could feel his heartbeat in his temples, in his wrists, in the old scar tissue across his right hand that had never fully healed after the third Delgado fight. Walk away, he told himself. This isn't your problem. The kid will survive. Embarrassment isn't death. Walk away and finish your shift and go home to Emma and pretend none of this ever happened. But his feet wouldn't move, because Kyle's eyes, glimpsed between Marcum's taunting slaps, looked exactly like Danny's had looked during their last sparring session. That mixture of exhaustion and determination. That refusal to quit even when quitting was the only sane option. That beautiful, stupid, heartbreaking loyalty to a sport that would never love them back the way they loved it. Danny's last words. The memory surfaced without permission, rising from the depths where William had kept it buried for 15 years. They'd been in the Kronk gym. Late evening, August heat turning the building into a sauna. Danny had been complaining about headaches for 3 days, but he'd shown up anyway because William's title fight was 8 weeks away and preparation didn't wait for comfort. Between rounds, while William caught his breath in his corner, Danny had leaned against the ropes and said something William hadn't understood at the time. You know what your problem is, Willie? William had laughed, still riding the high of a good session. I got problems now? Just one. Danny's voice had been serious beneath the sweat and exhaustion. You think your hands are just for fighting, but they're not. What you have, this gift, this thing you do that nobody else can do. It's not about hurting people. It's about protecting them. Protecting them from what? Danny had gestured vaguely at the gym around them, at the young fighters drilling in corners, at the amateurs who would never make it but kept showing up anyway because the ring was the only place they felt real. From guys who don't understand what power is for. From the ones who think being strong means making other people weak. Danny had tapped his own chest, right above his heart. Promise me something, Willie. When you're champion, when you're on top of the world and everyone's chanting your name, don't waste what you have. Use it to protect people. The ones who can't protect themselves. William had promised. And then, 20 minutes later, Danny was dead on the canvas. In the ring, Marcum had grown bored with light contact. His punches were landing harder now, leaving red marks on Kyle's arms where the kid desperately tried to cover up. The 2-minute timer must have expired, but no one had called time. The spectacle had taken on its own momentum. Come on, kid, hit me back. Marcum taunted, bouncing backward, arms spread wide in mockery. I'll give you a free shot. Right here. He tapped his own chin. Show everyone what 3 years of training taught you. Kyle threw a right hand. Marcum slipped it easily and countered with a hook to the body that folded the kid in half. Kyle staggered, gasping, one glove touching the canvas for balance. That's a knockdown, Marcum crowed. Somebody count. 8, 7, 6. The crowd laughed. Someone actually started counting along. William set down the mop. The motion was small, almost imperceptible, but something in its deliberateness made the nearest observers glance in his direction. The janitor stepping away from his cart. The invisible man becoming visible. Hey! William's voice wasn't loud. He hadn't raised it, hadn't projected, hadn't done any of the things Marcum did to fill a room. But something in its quality, some frequency buried beneath the quietness, cut through the noise like a blade through smoke. Marcum paused mid-countdown. His eyes found William across the gym floor. You say something, blue overalls? William walked toward the ring. Slow, steady. Each step covering ground he'd sworn he'd never cross again. Leave the kid alone. Marcum's grin widened. Or what? You gonna mop me to death? William reached the ring apron. He placed one hand on the bottom rope, the first time he'd touched a ring in 15 years. The canvas smell hit him like a drug, like a memory, like Danny's ghost whispering in his ear. Use it to protect people. Give me gloves, William said. The gym went quiet. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished match. Impossible to ignore, difficult to believe. The janitor had just asked for gloves. The man in blue overalls who emptied trash cans and scrubbed toilets had just inserted himself into a confrontation with a ranked professional fighter preparing for a televised title bout. Marcum laughed first. Of course he did. I'm sorry, what? He cupped a hand to his ear, leaning over the ropes toward William with theatrical disbelief. Did the mop guy just challenge me? Did that actually happen? Or am I having a stroke? Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd, but it was thinner now, uncertain. Something about the way William stood at the ring apron, the stillness of him, the absolute absence of hesitation, had introduced a frequency the room didn't recognize. Give me gloves, William repeated. Same volume, same calm, like he was ordering coffee, not requesting entry into a boxing ring with a man who got paid to hurt people. Eddie Tompkins, the gym owner, pushed through the gathered spectators. His face held the expression of a man watching his liability insurance premiums multiply in real time. "Will, what the hell are you doing? Get back to work." "This isn't." "It's fine, Eddie." Marcum waved dismissively, still grinning. "Let him in. This is perfect. This is exactly the demonstration I wanted." He turned to address the crowd, arms spread wide like a ringmaster introducing the evening's entertainment. "Ladies and gentlemen, forget the amateur. We've got something even better now. A real underdog story. Blue collar versus blue chip. The American dream versus the American reality." He pointed at William with a gloved hand. "Somebody get this man some gloves. I want everyone to see what happens when delusion meets profession." A trainer near the equipment area, the same one who'd been timing Kyle's humiliation, grabbed a pair of worn 16-ounce gloves from a hook on the wall. He tossed them toward the ring. William caught them without looking, a reflex so automatic it happened before his conscious mind registered the motion. The catch made a few people frown. The way he'd snatched them from the air, one-handed, casual, the gesture of someone who'd caught 10,000 pieces of equipment in exactly that manner, didn't match the narrative they'd already written about him. Kyle had climbed out of the ring, headgear removed, face flushed with shame and confusion. He stood near the ropes, watching William with an expression that mingled gratitude with concern. The janitor had intervened on his behalf. The janitor was about to get destroyed on his behalf. "You don't have to do this," Kyle said quietly as William passed him. William met the kid's eyes for half a second. "Yeah, I do." He climbed through the ropes. The canvas felt like coming home. William hadn't stood on a boxing ring surface in 15 years, but his feet recognized it immediately. The slight give, the texture through his work boots, the way the whole structure absorbed and redistributed weight with each step. His body remembered this. Every fiber, every muscle, every nerve ending that had spent a decade learning to exist in this specific environment. He stood in the corner, working his hands into the gloves. They were old, the padding compressed from years of use, but they'd serve. Marcum was bouncing on his toes in the opposite corner, throwing combinations at the air, playing to the crowd that had now grown to fill every available sightline. "No headgear for you either, huh?" Marcum called across the ring. "Brave. Stupid, but brave. Don't worry. I'll try not to leave any marks. Wouldn't want you to scare the customers at whatever fast food place you probably work at on weekends." William said nothing. He finished securing the gloves, then rolled his shoulders once. And everything changed. If you've been waiting for this moment, it's here. Drop a like right now and subscribe, because what happens in the next 60 seconds will leave you speechless. The shift was subtle enough that most observers couldn't identify exactly what had happened, but everyone felt it. A change in barometric pressure, in the quality of light, in the fundamental physics of the room. William's shoulders dropped 2 inches. Not a slump, a settling. The way a building settles into its foundation. His weight redistributed, sinking into his hips, his center of gravity lowering until he seemed rooted to the canvas by something deeper than muscle. His hands came up, not the frantic, desperate guard of an amateur, not even the technical positioning of a trained fighter. Something older, something that existed before coaches and training camps and YouTube tutorials. His gloves floated at chest height, loose, almost lazy, moving in small circles like leaves on still water. And his eyes. The eyes were what made Marcum's bouncing falter for just a fraction of a second. Gone was the quiet resignation of the janitor. Gone was the downward gaze of a man who'd spent 15 years perfecting invisibility. William's eyes had sharpened into something predatory and patient, something that saw not just Marcum but through him. Reading his stance, his weight distribution, the microtensions in his shoulders that would telegraph every punch before he threw it. The Detroit ghost looked out from behind William Henkel's face. Marcum recognized it. Not consciously, he'd never met William before, never seen footage of his fights, never heard the nickname that still circulated in certain boxing circles like an urban legend. But something ancient in his fighter's brain, some survival instinct honed through years of competition, registered what his conscious mind refused to accept. This was wrong. This was very, very wrong. The janitor wasn't standing like a janitor anymore. The janitor was standing like a killer. "Anytime you're ready," William said quietly. His voice had changed too. Lower, calmer. The voice of a man who'd had this conversation 100 times before, who knew exactly how it would end, who was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Marcum's grin flickered. Just for an instant. A momentary power outage behind his eyes, before he forced it back into place. The crowd was watching. The phones were recording. He couldn't show uncertainty. Couldn't admit that the mop guy had somehow, impossibly, made him feel like prey. "All right, tough guy." Marcum moved to the center of the ring, gloves raised, falling into his fighting stance with the fluid confidence of a ranked professional. "Let's see what you've got." William walked forward to meet him. Not bounced. Not stalked. Walked. The way you'd walk to your mailbox, or to your car, or to any other mundane destination that held no fear and required no preparation. His feet barely seemed to leave the canvas, gliding forward in a shuffle so economical it looked almost slow. But the distance between them evaporated faster than Marcum expected. Suddenly the janitor was inside his range. Suddenly those floating hands were closer than they should have been. Suddenly the ghost was real and present and standing close enough that Marcum could see the flecks of gray in his irises. Marcum threw a jab, fast, professional, the punch that had opened 100 fights. It hit nothing. William's head moved 3 inches to the left. No more than necessary. No wasted motion. The jab sailed past his ear like it had been aimed at someone standing behind him. And in the split second of Marcum's extension, William could have countered. Could have thrown the right hand that had knocked out 32 professional fighters without exception. Could have ended this before it truly began. Instead, he just looked at Marcum. Patient. Calm. Waiting. The message was clear. "I'm giving you a chance to understand what you've walked into." Marcum's face went pale. The gym had fallen completely silent. Marcum's second jab came faster than the first. It hit air. William had already moved, not backward, not sideways, but through some invisible diagonal that existed only in the geometry of fighters who transcended mere technique. His head vacated the space Marcum's fist occupied, and by the time the punch completed its trajectory, William was standing somewhere else entirely. No counter, no retaliation, just absence where presence should have been. "Lucky slip," Marcum muttered, more to himself than the crowd. He reset his stance, bounced twice, and fired a 3-punch combination: jab, cross, left hook, the bread and butter of professional boxing, the sequence that had put 14 opponents on the canvas in his career. William dissolved around each punch like smoke. The jab whistled past his chin as he leaned back 2 inches. The cross found nothing as he pivoted his shoulders, letting the fist graze past his ear close enough to feel the wind. The hook swept through empty space because William had already dropped his weight, dipping beneath the arc with a movement so fluid it looked choreographed. 3 punches, 3 misses, and William hadn't thrown a single strike in return. The crowd stirred. Confused murmurs rippled through the spectators. This wasn't how fights worked. When professionals threw combinations, amateurs got hit. When ranked boxers opened up on janitors, janitors bled. The script everyone had written in their heads, the one where Marcum taught the mop guy a quick, brutal lesson about knowing his place, was refusing to follow its expected plot. "Stand still," Marcum growled. William said nothing. His hands remained in that strange floating guard, circling gently, almost hypnotically. His feet kept gliding across the canvas in patterns that seemed random but somehow always placed him exactly where Marcum's punches weren't. Marcum attacked again. A straight right hand thrown with genuine professional power, the kind of punch that could separate consciousness from skull if it landed clean. William's head moved before the punch launched, sliding offline by a margin so narrow that observers gasped, certain they'd witnessed impact until they realized Marcum's glove had touched nothing but gymnasium air. It was the timing that made people's skin prickle. William wasn't reacting to Marcum's punches. He was reacting to Marcum's intentions, reading the thoughts before they became movements, seeing the attacks in the twitch of a shoulder or the shift of weight that preceded every strike by a fraction of a second. He was fighting Marcum's mind, not his fists. "What the hell?" someone in the crowd breathed. Marcum heard it. The comment landed in his ears like a judgment, like the first crack in the facade of invincibility he'd carefully constructed over his career. His face flushed red. Embarrassment and anger twisted into something dangerous. He abandoned technique entirely. What followed was less boxing than assault. A barrage of punches thrown with fury rather than strategy, power without precision, the desperate attack of a man trying to prove a point through sheer volume of violence. Hooks, uppercuts, overhands, wild swings that would have made his trainers cringe. Marcum emptied his arsenal at the janitor in blue overalls, throwing everything he had with murderous intent. William walked through it like a ghost. That was the only word for what the crowd witnessed. Not dodging, not slipping, walking. William moved through the storm of leather and bad intentions with an almost meditative calm, his feet carrying him in slow circles around the ring while Marcum's fists found nothing but empty air. A right hook sailed over William's head as he dipped. A left uppercut grazed past his ribs as he pivoted. A lunging overhand right, the kind of punch that ended bar fights and amateur careers, missed by inches as William simply leaned backward, letting momentum carry Marcum past him like a bull missing a matador. Marcum was breathing hard now. Not from damage, William still hadn't touched him, but from exertion. The professional fighter was exhausting himself against a target that refused to be where his fists expected. Each missed punch cost energy. Each failed combination drained the tank a little more. And the worst part, the part that was clearly driving Marcum toward psychological collapse, was that William wasn't even trying. There was no effort visible in the janitor's movements. No strain, no urgency, no indication that avoiding a professional boxer's assault required anything more demanding than a casual stroll through a familiar neighborhood. He made it look easy. He made Marcum look foolish. "Fight back!" Marcum screamed, his voice cracking with frustration. "Stop running and fight back! You coward!" William stopped moving. The sudden stillness was more unsettling than his evasion had been. He stood in the center of the ring, hands still floating in that lazy guard, and let Marcum catch his breath. Waited, patient, the eye of a hurricane granting temporary mercy to the destruction around it. "I'm not running," William said quietly. "You just can't hit me." The words were simple, delivered without malice or arrogance. A statement of fact, like noting that water was wet or that gravity pulled downward, and somehow that made them worse, more devastating than any insult, more humiliating than any taunt. Marcum's face contorted. Beyond anger now, beyond embarrassment, he was experiencing something he'd probably never encountered in his professional career. Complete and utter impotence against an opponent who refused to respect his reputation. He charged. No technique at all this time. Just a bull rush, closing distance through sheer aggression, planning to overwhelm William with physicality since skill had failed. Marcum was younger, bigger, stronger. If he could get his hands on the janitor, could turn this into a brawl rather than a boxing match. William pivoted on his back foot. The movement was small, a quarter turn, a redistribution of weight, but it placed him perfectly outside Marcum's charging trajectory. The professional fighter stumbled past, momentum carrying him toward the ropes, and by the time he spun around, William was standing exactly where he'd been before, waiting, still patient, still not breathing hard. The crowd had stopped murmuring. A profound silence had descended over Iron Peak Boxing Gym, broken only by Marcum's ragged gasps and the creak of ring ropes settling after his collision with them. Everyone understood now. Even those with no boxing knowledge, no fighting experience, no frame of reference for what they were watching. They all understood that something extraordinary was happening. Something that defied the categories they'd used to organize the world. The janitor was a master. Cal Torres stood frozen at ringside, mouth open, tears streaming down his face without his awareness. He was watching a resurrection, watching a legend emerge from the disguise of ordinary life, watching proof that heroes could hide in plain sight, waiting for the moment they were needed. Marcum leaned against the ropes, chest heaving, arms heavy at his sides. His gloves felt like they weighed 40 pounds each. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, blurring his vision. He'd thrown more punches in the last 90 seconds than he typically threw in an entire round of competitive fighting. He'd landed nothing. "Who are you?" Marcum gasped between breaths. William didn't answer. Instead, his weight shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly. But those who knew fighting, the trainers, the experienced boxers watching from the crowd, recognized what that shift meant. The ghost had finished walking. Now the ghost was going to work. Marcum pushed himself off the ropes. His arms felt like they were filled with wet concrete. His lungs burned with each breath, oxygen debt accumulating from the wasted assault that had landed nothing, accomplished nothing, proven nothing except his own inadequacy against a man who cleaned toilets for a living. But he was still a professional, still ranked, still 8 weeks away from a televised title fight that would define his career. He couldn't lose here. Not to this, not to a janitor, not in front of witnesses with phones recording every second of his humiliation. He forced his guard back up, willed his legs to move, found somewhere in the depleted reserves of his pride enough fuel for one more attack. "Lucky," he muttered, convincing no one, least of all himself. "You're just lucky, running around like a scared little." He threw the jab. It was a good punch. Even exhausted, even rattled, even operating on fumes and desperation, Marcum's jab was the product of years of professional training. Fast, technically sound, the kind of punch that opened combinations and set up power shots. William slipped it, same as before, head moving just enough, just in time, letting the leather whisper past his cheek. But this time something was different. This time William's weight transferred. The shift was invisible to most observers. A settling of his hips, a rotation beginning in his planted back foot, energy coiling upward through his legs into his core like a spring compressing toward release. His left hand stayed high, guarding his chin, while his right dropped 2 inches. Loading. Marcum saw none of this. He was already committed to the cross that followed his jab, the power punch that would redeem him, that would end this embarrassment and restore the natural order of the universe. His right hand launched toward William's jaw with everything he had left. It missed. William had pivoted offline, letting Marcum's cross sail past his shoulder. And in the same motion, part of the same seamless movement, really one action with 2 consequences, he stepped inside Marcum's extended arm. Into the pocket. Into range. Into the space where violence lived. Marcum's eyes widened. Some primitive part of his brain recognized what was happening, understood that he'd overextended, knew that his chin was exposed and his weight was wrong and he was completely, catastrophically vulnerable. But recognition and reaction are different things. By the time his nervous system began formulating a defensive response, William's right hand was already in motion. The punch came from nowhere and everywhere. It started in William's feet, traveled up through legs that remembered 10,000 hours of road work, rotated through hips that had generated knockout power in 32 consecutive professional fights, transferred through a core that still held the muscle memory of championship-caliber technique. William's right hook connected with Marcum's jaw at the precise intersection of timing, leverage, and anatomical vulnerability that separated ordinary punches from legendary ones. The sound was distinctive, not the dramatic thwack of movie sound effects, but something duller, wetter, the sound of force transferring through bone, of consciousness being disconnected from its moorings. A sound that everyone in the gym would remember for years, would describe to friends and family who wouldn't quite believe them, would hear again in dreams both troubled and awestruck. Marcum's head snapped sideways. His eyes went blank before his body understood what had happened. The lights behind his pupils flickered and extinguished, and for a moment he simply stood there, suspended between vertical and horizontal, between consciousness and void, between the person he'd been and the cautionary tale he was becoming. Then gravity remembered him. He dropped. Not a stumble, not a stagger, not the desperate grab for ropes that fighters sometimes managed when hurt badly. Marcum fell the way buildings fall in controlled demolitions. Straight down, structural integrity completely compromised, nothing remaining to resist the pull of the earth. His back hit the canvas with a sound that echoed through the silent gym. His arms flopped outward, cruciform, gloves pointing toward opposite corners of the ring. His eyes stared upward at the fluorescent lights without seeing them. Out before he landed. William stood over him for 3 seconds. His right hand remained extended, frozen at the end of its arc, the fist still perfectly formed. His breathing hadn't changed. His expression hadn't shifted. He looked like a man who had just completed an unremarkable task. Taking out the garbage, mopping a floor, punching an unconscious professional boxer. Then he lowered his hand and stepped back. The gym was silent. Not quiet. Silent. The absolute absence of sound that occurs when a collective of people simultaneously forgets how to breathe. No one moved. No one spoke. No one did anything except stare at the impossible thing they had just witnessed. Cal Torres stood at ringside with both hands pressed over his mouth, tears streaming freely down his cheeks now, his young body shaking with emotions too complex to name. Vindication. Awe. The devastating realization that everything he thought he knew about the world had been wrong. Eddie Tompkins gripped the ring apron with white knuckles, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine that couldn't decide where to land. Confusion, recognition, something approaching fear. The trainers and fighters and casual gym members who had gathered to watch a janitor get humiliated now stood frozen in the aftermath of a revelation. The phones that had been recording continued to capture footage, but the hands holding them had gone still. Someone should have started counting. Someone should have checked on Marcum, still motionless on the canvas, chest rising and falling with the shallow breaths of the deeply unconscious. Someone should have done something, but no one could move. William turned away from Marcum's fallen form. He walked toward the ropes, movements unhurried, and began working off the borrowed gloves with his teeth. One hand free, then the other. He set the gloves on the ring apron, careful and respectful, the way you'd treat equipment that had served its purpose faithfully. He climbed through the ropes, stepped down from the ring, felt the concrete of the gym floor under his work boots, solid and familiar. The crowd parted for him. Unconsciously, instinctively, the way pedestrians might part for something they didn't fully understand but knew enough to respect. William walked through the gap they created, heading toward his mop cart, toward the tools of his invisible trade. Behind him, Marcum groaned. The first sound of returning consciousness. Not words, not movement, just the animal vocalization of a brain rebooting after forced shutdown. William didn't look back. He reached his cart, placed his hands on the familiar handle, stared at the mop bucket, the gray water, the rags and cleaning supplies that had defined his existence for 15 years. The ghost had walked. The ghost had struck. And now the ghost had to figure out how to be a janitor again. But somewhere in the crowd, a young trainer with too much curiosity was already typing on his phone, already searching, already pulling at threads that would unravel everything William had spent a decade and a half trying to bury. The silence finally broke. A wave of noise, questions, exclamations, but William barely heard it. He was listening to something older. Danny's voice, somewhere in his memory, saying, "That's it, Willie. That's what it's for." Kyle Torres couldn't sleep. He'd gone home after the gym finally emptied, after Marcum's entourage had helped the groggy fighter to his feet and ushered him out through the back entrance to avoid further humiliation, after Eddie Tompkins had locked the doors with hands that still trembled slightly. Kyle had walked the 11 blocks to his apartment in a daze, replaying those 90 seconds in his mind on an endless loop. The slip, the pivot, the punch. One punch. Now it was 2 a.m. and Kyle sat cross-legged on his bed, laptop balanced on his knees, fingers hovering over the keyboard. He'd typed the same search query 6 times, deleting it each time before hitting enter. 7th time was the charm. William Henkel Boxer, Detroit. The results loaded instantly. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. The first link was a Wikipedia article. The second was an ESPN retrospective from 2015. The third was a YouTube compilation titled The Detroit Ghost, Boxing's Most Devastating Mystery. He clicked the Wikipedia article first, scrolling past the summary box with shaking fingers. William James Henkel, born March 3, 1986, is a former American professional boxer who competed from 2006 to 2009. Nicknamed the Detroit Ghost for his exceptional defensive skills and elusive ring movement, Henkel compiled a perfect professional record of 32-0 with 32 knockouts before abruptly retiring at age 23. Kyle kept reading. Henkel was scheduled to fight for the WBA welterweight championship in October 2009, but withdrew from the bout following the death of his sparring partner, Daniel Fletcher, during a training session in August of that year. Medical examiners determined that Fletcher died from a ruptured brain aneurysm, and Henkel was cleared of any wrongdoing. Despite this, Henkel never fought professionally again and has remained out of public view since his retirement. There was a photograph embedded in the article. Young William Henkel, maybe 22, standing in a ring with his hands raised in victory. Same eyes, same quiet intensity, same ghost looking out from behind a face that had aged 15 years in the interim. Kyle clicked the YouTube link. The compilation was 12 minutes long. 12 minutes of the most beautiful defensive boxing Kyle had ever witnessed. William slipping punches by millimeters. William making ranked professionals look like amateurs. William ending fights with single counters so perfectly timed they seemed choreographed. The comments section was filled with people asking what happened to him. Where did he go? Why did he stop? Kyle now knew the answers. He closed his laptop and cried until morning. William made pancakes. It was Saturday, which meant Emma didn't have school, which meant he could let her sleep until the smell of batter and butter drew her out of her room. This had been their ritual since she was old enough to climb onto a kitchen stool. Saturday pancakes, no exceptions, regardless of what else was happening in their lives. Today, what was happening was that William's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd considered running. The thought had crossed his mind at least a dozen times during his sleepless night. Pack 2 bags, wake Emma, Drive until Detroit was a memory in the rearview mirror. Start over somewhere new, somewhere the videos wouldn't follow, somewhere the ghost could stay buried. But Emma had her choir concert next Friday. She'd been practicing for months. And William had promised himself 15 years ago that he would never let his past steal his daughter's future. So he made pancakes. Emma emerged at 9:17, hair tangled, still wearing the oversized concert t-shirt she slept in. She shuffled to the kitchen stool and planted her elbows on the counter, chin resting in her hands. "Morning, Dad. Morning, sweetheart. Sleep okay? Weird dreams." She yawned. "You?" William flipped a pancake. The batter sizzled against the pan, filling the small kitchen with the smell of normalcy, of ordinary mornings, of a life he might have already lost. "Not really." Emma studied him with the perceptiveness of a 13-year-old who'd learned to read her father's silences. "Something wrong. If you've followed this story from the beginning, you know that this moment matters. Like and subscribe right now because this is where everything changes for William and Emma forever." William turned off the stove. He set the spatula down carefully, precisely the way he did everything. Then he walked around the counter and sat on the stool beside his daughter. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." He told her everything. The boxing, the nickname, the record, the title shot that never happened. Danny especially. Described in the halting, broken sentences of a man excavating memories he'd spent 15 years trying to bury. Emma listened without interrupting. Her eyes grew wider at certain points, glistened at others. When William described the night Danny died, she reached out and took his hand. Not speaking, just holding, anchoring him to the present while he navigated the treacherous waters of the past. When he finished, the pancakes were cold and the morning sun had shifted across the kitchen floor. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emma finally asked. Her voice held no accusation, only curiosity and something that might have been relief. "I was afraid." William's voice cracked. "Afraid you'd see me differently. Afraid you'd be scared of me. Afraid that, if I said it out loud, it would become real again." "Dad." Emma squeezed his hand. "You clean toilets for a living. You make me pancakes every Saturday. You've never even yelled at me. Not once my entire life." She smiled, small and sad and understanding beyond her years. "You're not scary. You're just broken. And broken things can be fixed." William pulled his daughter into a hug and held her until the shaking finally stopped. Kyle was waiting outside Iron Peak when William arrived for his Monday shift. The kid looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles under his eyes, clothes rumpled, gym bag clutched against his chest like a security blanket. But there was something different in his posture, something that hadn't been there before. "Hope, I know who you are," Kyle said without preamble. "I found the videos, the articles, everything." William nodded slowly. "I figured someone would. 32-0. All knockouts. The youngest welterweight contender in 15 years. Kyle's voice trembled with barely contained awe. "You were going to be champion. Everyone said so. That was a long time ago. It was yesterday." Kyle stepped closer, eyes blazing with something that looked almost like anger. "I watched you take apart a ranked professional without breaking a sweat. I watched you do something impossible. And then you just went back to your mop. Like it was nothing." William was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want, Kyle?" "I want you to train me." The request hung in the air between them. Kyle's face held the desperate hunger of a 19-year-old who'd glimpsed something extraordinary and couldn't bear to let it slip away. "I'm not a trainer," William said. "Then learn." Kyle's voice cracked. "Please." I've been working with coaches who treat me like a paycheck and sparring partners who treat me like a joke. I've been fighting for 3 years and I still don't know what I'm doing. He gestured toward the gym behind William. But when I watched you move, when I saw what boxing actually looks like when someone understands it, I realized I've been doing everything wrong. William thought about Danny, about the promise he'd made and broken, about 15 years of hiding from a gift he'd convinced himself was a curse. Don't waste what you have, Willie. Use it to protect people. If I train you, William said slowly, we do it my way. No shortcuts. No ego. You learn defense before offense. You learn discipline before power. And you learn that real strength protects, never destroys. Kyle nodded frantically. Whatever you say. I'll do whatever you say. William extended his hand. Kyle shook it. And somewhere, in a place beyond memory and grief, Danny Fletcher smiled.